In this week's assignment, we're going to take all the basic types of image manipulation that I've exposed you to, add in a couple more, and stack them into a final useful result. Now, our goal in this exercise is to track a screen onto this empty smartphone. So we're going to take this image here and we're going to stick it on to the smartphone using trackers and corner pins. So it looks like this. So let's get right into it. Start with the tracker node. Now the trackers node's job is to look for features in the scene and then follow them or track them to create motion curves or animation curves. Usually don't need to touch the defaults in them because they're pretty good in Nuke. So I'm just going to show you the basics. And if you'd like to dig deeper, you can look at the documentation to see what all the different tabs do. To add trackers, you click this button here, the Add Tracks button, and this will allow you to drop down new tracks. Now the way it works is this smaller box on the inside is the pattern to search for, and this larger box on the outside is the area to search for that pattern. So the bigger you make the outside box, the slower it's going to be to search because it has a larger area to search. And if you're only interested in a particular pattern, there's no reason to grab a larger inner box because it's just going to be searching a bigger pattern for no reason. Corners are usually the best thing to track, so I'm going to position it right on the corner here, and then we'll get on to making some more trackers. Now you'll notice I'm working right in the middle of the shot, and that's only because that's where I started. We'll see how to deal with that in a second. It's usually not a big deal. You can track forwards and backwards. But the important detail of working in the middle of the shot here is that I've defined my search pattern as this frame 96. So you have to keep that in mind. Each time you drag a tracker, Nuke will automatically define a new pattern. So you want to be careful about dragging or moving the tracking markers on frames that aren't the frame you've established as the search pattern frame. I'm creating all of these trackers on the same frame just for the sake of simplicity and to make it easier for me as a human being to sort of know what's going on. And I'm going to select all of the trackers that I would like to make active when I run the tracking. To have it actually track, you use the shuttle controls here. This tracks forward by 1 frame. This tracks forward, and this tracks forward to the end of the range that you've set. I usually just use the track forward and back keys. So now Nuke will run through the shot, and it will track those features and make motion tracks. Now, I was only able to track to the end of the shot. In order to track the other direction, I'm resetting to frame 96, and I'm tracking backwards. Now, sometimes this strategy of tracking forwards and backwards can be really helpful if, for example, something obstructs one of the trackers midway through the track. You can track forwards or backwards first until the obstruction blocks the tracker, and then track the other direction. And if you need to create the in-between frames manually, you can do that. So it looks like Nuke created a fairly good track. Those tracks are sticking right on. There's several ways you can use the tracker node itself to do transformations. If you go to the transformation tab here, you can have it stabilize a shot or match move a shot based on the information in these trackers. And that will respect whatever checkboxes you've checked here. So if I only wanted each one of these tracks to affect translation, I would check 2. If I wanted them to affect rotation, I would tick off R. And if I wanted them to affect scale, I could check off S. Then, when I selected this pull down, those tracks would influence the result of these different transforms, like stabilize, match move, and remove jitter. Another way you can use it is by selecting this pull down and generating a whole new node to do an effect. We're interested in corner pin, so we're going to use this first option. Now, an important thing for when you do a corner pin is to pick the frame you would like to have as a reference frame. The reference frame is sort of like the zero frame that the corner pin will push around relative to the rest of the frames. It's kind of the frame you want to do all your work on. So I'm going to scrub through the shot here and see what a good frame for a sort of zero frame might be, and it looks like they're all pretty much the same, so it honestly doesn't matter, I think, which one I choose. I'm going to just choose frame 1 so I can remember it easily. So I've chosen frame 1, and I'm going to say create a corner pin with this as the reference frame. And you'll notice that Nuke has generated a corner pin node that's expression linked to the tracker. I like to stick these trackers sort of off to the side because now this tracker has become a tool that's holding these tracks for me, and I don't really want to accidentally edit it or mess it up. So we have a corner pin node, but what are we going to do with it? Well, the first thing you need to do is position the thing you'd like to corner pin into their correct place. Let's just look at what it's doing right out of the box here. So I'm going to drop down a merge node. I'm going to merge one of these simple screens over my background. And I'm going to put the corner pin in between the two so that it's driving that background to animate it. And we'll view it at the merge. And you'll see it doesn't look like much. In fact, it doesn't seem to have moved the image at all that I'm trying to stick on the screen. So what's happening here? Well, remember that 1 is the reference frame, which means that on 1, nothing's actually happening. As we move forward, you'll see the corner pin is affecting that image, but it's still not positioned where we need it to be. Well, as you remember, many of the transforms can concatenate, and corner pin is no exception. So there's no reason that I couldn't put a corner pin above the corner pin to stick this image where I want it to be. So for now, I'm just going to disable this corner pin by hitting D. And I'm going to create a new corner pin node above it. And I'll use this corner pin node to position that image where I want it. Now, one problem here is that it put the corners of the initial position where this image was rather than the other image that I wanted to distort. So rather than dropping it in the open here, I'm going to drop it connected to the tube image, and that will cause the corners in the initial position to start at the corners of that image. There we go. That'll make things a little bit easier. So now when I view my over, I can start using this corner pin to position the screen where I would like it in this image. So now we're just basically manually positioning the screen over the other. To make this job a little easier, I'm going to actually fade this out a little bit using the mix control of the merge node so I can see through it a little bit better while I'm working. I'm going to try to position those right on the corners of my tracking markers because those little tracking markers were exactly in the corners of the screen on the smartphone. There we have it. It looks like it's in the right place. Now remember, this zero frame, nothing has moved from the corner pin that's driven by the trackers. So if I toggle that back on now by hitting D, it will now push along the image that I have stuck on the screen. Well, that's great. Let's mix this over all the way up and take a look at that. That looks okay, but you know what? That screen looks awfully fake. It looks too bright and too solid, and not to mention it's too sharp. So it still needs some work. Let's keep going. Now, one feature that I think is worth mentioning is that the screen has some reflections on it, which I think if we want this to look perfect, we're going to have to get those to come through in our composite. So perhaps an over isn't the right operation to use in the first place. If we wanted to add the screen on as if it was a luminous thing, like a real screen, the correct operation would probably be an add. So I'm going to switch this to plus. Wow, it already looks a little bit more solid or more real because the reflections of the original screen and the brightness of the screen, because you'll notice it was never perfectly black to begin with, are showing through, which makes it look a little bit more tactile and real. Now, the problem that we've gotten as a result of that is that the tracking markers are now showing through because I'm only adding the two together. So that's not great. That's another thing we need to fix.